All right, welcome to the channel. We're here, and this is my reaction to Rush playing Finding My Way live. Now, I've heard him play this live. I saw Rush several times in the late 80s and in the early 90s, and they are still one of my favorite groups. And one of the most anticipated happenings in music this year was the debut of Annika Niles, not sure how to pronounce her last name, as the drummer for the band. So these are, I can't even imagine what it would be like to have to step into that world. But I was excited, and I was curious as to how she would interpret the music that they play. And I've got some pretty sort of technical musical ideas to sort of share with you guys. And I don't mean to sound boring or overly analytical, but I'm going to be. So if you want a real just sort of granular take on this, you can listen to me, or you can go to other channels. So there's a lot of people who've been commenting on this. So I was actually working on some score, and this popped up as a YouTube alert, some kind of in my feed, like, oh, Rush plays JUNO Awards. So immediately I sort of switched over to this and postponed writing of the cue until after I do this review. So here we go, Finding My Way. And you won't hear any of the audio on my end, but here we go. So great guitar riff, as we know. Drums come in. Great. Keeping time, it's a rock song, straight rock, 2 and 4 on the drums. So we're going back into the guitar sort of riff that kicks off the piece after the first verse. She's doing a great job. I mean, I have no complaints. I mean, she's a very technical drummer. I've enjoyed listening to her play other things. I think it's really impossible to sort of compare anybody to Neil, but I want to say this about Rush. And now I'm going to go off on like a weird tangent about the band. Rush was a sort of a three-legged beast in that they were all brilliant musicians. They're all different musicians. But what's really interesting about the band is Alex and Geddy really haven't played in any other bands. I mean, they've had side projects, sure. Alex had a couple of side projects, and Geddy had a solo album. But the two of them have been sort of in sync with each other for so long. It's hard to separate those two from that sound. Now, Neil, when Neil entered the picture, Neil replaced John Rutsey, who was the original drummer of the band, who was an adequate drummer, but didn't have the technical sort of chops that Neil had. And this is where my review is going to get a little strange. I've always have seen Rush, and when I was younger, they were just my favorite band. But as I got to know music more, and as I got to explore more music, and I got to really study drumming and all of that, my thoughts about Rush changed, and they weren't negatively changing. They were just changing as I got exposed to more popular music, but also more drummers and just more sort of styles, and I started writing my own music, etc. But anyway, all that aside, when Neil went to England, he didn't get a job in bands. He wasn't playing in bands. He couldn't get work in bands. He had to come back to Canada. And I always have had this theory about the three of them where they're actually sounding the best when those three musicians are playing with each other. In other words, I don't think Alex, Geddy, and Neil would have had the kind of success that they would have had they done separate things or they had never met. I always saw them as a perfectly purpose-built unit for each other because of how unique they are as musicians. They're technically very well adept. They're very musical. Compositionally, their songs are very composed, as we know. And I once heard somebody say at somebody who worked very closely with their opening acts, who's a good friend of mine, actually. I'm not going to say who that person is, but they were very close to Rush by proxy, having had worked for other groups. They said something to me once many years ago. They said, Rush they don't really jam. They don't really jam together. And I thought about that for a long time. And I realized the groove that Rush has is more of a very thought out, composed groove, kind of like Yes. And this is where I think Rush is a lot more like, like most prog rocks. It's a very deliberate style of playing. And so I think it's very interesting that they kicked off the show with a song that is not so technical, just more straight up rock from their first record. And it doesn't have all the technical stuff that sort of they're known for, especially after Neil sort of started contributing parts. So that's my sort of overall big picture take on them. Now, let's get more specific to Annika's playing. She is approaching this with a very heavy emphasis on following what Alex and Geddy are doing. So Neil would play very ahead or up on the beat. And she's playing a little bit more mid-beat, kind of behind it slightly. And this is a huge difference in drumming that I think a lot of people don't really get. And one of the things that she's doing is she's providing a very sort of pocket for them to sort of lie into versus pushing them far forward. And again, this is the only track I've heard. I don't know how she's going to assert herself on the other tracks, but I know that for me, peak Rush, there is such a thing, for me in terms of their performance was probably the mid 80s to the early 90s when they were just at the very top of their game physically and they were pushing tempos really hard. And I think if you look at the Grace Under Pressure tour, the live set, you get a sense of that really just push very much on the front of the beat. And it kind of reminds me of the contrast between Bill Bruford and Phil Collins, where Phil Collins would play a little bit more on the back of it, and Bruford would push more on the forward of it, which made Collins' drumming have such a deep pocket because he could kind of do both. And then when you combined Chester Thompson and Phil Collins together, so I know this is more of a commentary on sort of drummers writ large, it sort of brought the gravity of Genesis really more towards the center of the rhythmical structure versus the forward part. So let's continue. And she's playing the initial fills of the song. Now, one thing I've noticed about this is the enthusiasm of the band is they really look like they're enjoying themselves. On the 2 and 4 again. Great fill. But it is a deeper, more kind of pulled back pocket than I think what Neil was doing. So that's just a commentary on that. Where I feel like Alex is pushing a little bit on the tempo. And then with the cowbell, more cowbell. Phil was great. Again, great fills. And again, that pocket is just, it's a different feel. I think it was more of a feel that may have, that Neil was sort of going for when he started working with Freddie Gruber, where the feel of the band changed. So the feel is really important in a band. And I like the feel and I like the energy a lot. And again, you know, I think a lot of us who are so programmed to hear this band with that other drummer, I don't know if it's going to take us some time to get used to it, but it's a different quality, and it's a positive quality, and it's a quality that I really, really enjoy hearing. I feel as though it's natural, it's not forced. I feel that they're cohesive as a group. I don't, and I want to talk about Neil again. So, and this is something I really, I'm a little bit sort of hesitant to admit to, but I avoided seeing Rush in the latter part of their career because I always felt like, although Neil is such a good, awesome, technical, great drummer, I kind of felt during the last, like, especially 15 years that they were playing as a group, that sort of fire was not quite as present. And that may have been a function of age, I don't know. But Neil's aggressive sort of tenacity, as I like to put it, was not as present in the actual last 15 years that they played. And I think that's one of the problems you have when you see a band when they're a lot younger. They're playing their music off the record, so to speak, in the spirit of that, but even with more energy. And it kind of felt like Rush was playing a lot of their tracks as though they were a little less elastic. You know, there was a little less bounce to them. And this, again, is a very sort of threading the needle here, splitting hair kind of commentary on this band. But that's one of the reasons why I sort of decided to not pursue them as much as I had when I was young in terms of like seeing them and going to their shows. I felt like that what I had seen in the late 80s and in the early 90s was really a very sort of highly cultivated, extremely aggressive version of what they are now. Now, that being said, we've only heard one song, and I am really anxious to hear and excited to hear what else she's going to do on those other tracks. I will say that there is a levity to the band that I haven't seen, and I think that levity was just seeing them with different players, but also Neil brought so much gravity to the band, both sort of as a lyricist and as a musician. But he was such a serious guy. I mean, if you've read his books or if you've seen interviews with him, and the band seems to have a lightness to it that I haven't ever seen them have, and almost more joy and less seriousness. But that's to be determined because, again, this is only one snippet of what is going to be a full set that they're going to play. So what's my overall opinion? 2 thumbs up. I really love it. I really love it. Especially as I just listen to the music and I remember that, you know, I loved Rush, not just because of Neil's playing, but I loved all of them playing their music together. And so to hear most of the original, well, this is the original group. I mean, Alex and Geddy are the original members of the band. So let's continue. I'm really digressing here, but this is what I do. So here we go. Kind of a breakdown here, and this is at 3:42. You can hear the keyboards now. So there's a new keyboard player too. Great film. So another observation is you're really hearing Alex and Geddy playing. I mean, you're really hearing them. And it's actually in some ways kind of nice that the drums are more in that pocket, because it really becomes especially in this song, it becomes more about the rockness, you know, the guitar and the bass. And I really, really like that a lot. Again, she's got a deep pocket, and I still feel like they're getting to know each other a little bit, but it's still sounding amazing. Does it sound like Rush? Of course it sounds like Rush. It's going to sound more like Rush in later Rush, because this is early Rush, where they sounded a lot like a hard rock act. So I'm very curious as to hear how is Red Barchetta going to sound? How are some of the tracks off of Moving Pictures going to sound? And so far, out of all the drummers I've heard them play with, the tribute to Taylor Hawkins and all that, you know, she doesn't have a stiff sort of feel. And I think that was one of the sort of complaints that people had about Neil, was so metronomic, so stiff, brilliant technical drummer. But yet, if you look at Neil playing on the jazz things, you realize that he's a very technical rock drummer and not as much of a groove orientated jazz drummer. He's not that at all. And she's got a lot more flexibility in this world. And that's going to be the really interesting part, is how that translates to the subsequent sort of catalog that Rush made, which is many records, as we know. And so I'm very curious as to how that groove is going to translate into those later records. Love the sound of the drums too. Tempo increases a little bit through the ending section. So this would be 4:36 to the end. Great ending. Yeah, I love it. I love it. And the first time I saw it, I have to admit, I got a little teary-eyed. Yes, I'll admit that here on the channel. So those are my initial thoughts of Rush with the latest addition to the band. Again, I think it's great. So stay tuned. And I'll do other videos that have nothing to do with Rush, obviously. But I just wanted to do one more. Oh, and there's one more video I'm going to do, which is the Grace Under Pressure live set and the Dolby Atmos Grace Under Pressure studio album, which is insane, especially if you're an Alex fan. The guitars have really been brought out on that. But that's more about that later. All right. Have a great day, folks. I got to get back to work.